It was the perfect way to begin.
Coffee enemas.
Coffee enemas for the royalty. Hi, everybody. Hi, folks watching at home later on. We were just talking about the royals and frozen peepees. Um, welcome to week 2. So I always begin, and I did just before to see if anyone had any reading experiences that were worth talking about this week, and Justin had an interesting one. But I'll do that, and then I'll sort of share the plan for today, which is to kind of go through. I figured we could talk through a couple more cards the way we did last week, just from like a form and function standpoint. And then I was going to sort of jump right into the grand tableau this week, but then I thought, the last thing that we did last week was start to look at card combos. And I thought what would be more appropriate for us to play around with this week are the different reading techniques that get used in the grand tableau. And then next week we can look at the grand tableau. And then the final week I was thinking we could look at the playing card inserts. And there's a really slim book about playing cards that I meant to look up that I liked. And I need to now just Google it really quick. It's really brief, but I think it's self-published. Why am I using that keyboard when I can just use the one that's in front of me? That if you want to kind of like get a head, like a ground level of playing cards. Let me see if I can remember the name of it.
Is it the Roger Horn?
That rings a bell to me. It's very, very slim.
Cartomancy and Folk Witchcraft, Playing Cards in Marseille. It's a very long title.
That may be it. Let's see.
It's brown.
It is brown. That rings a bell. Oh my God. Nothing is working today. Cartomancy and folk witchcraft, right? That's actually not it, but it is similar. I'll Google it during the break. I was trying to find it, and actually I may have it listed somewhere here in my saved thingies, cards. I don't want to spend like the whole video looking for it.
Is it just on like reading with playing cards, or?
Yeah. And you don't need it. I just liked it and was going to use it as kind of a.
No, I think I might have that book. I have a really slim playing card book. So.
Oh, wait. No, it's not this. All right, never mind. All right, we'll worry about that later. Anyway, anyone have any thoughts or things to talk about from last week, or anything interesting to share?
I was trying to do some Lenormand readings.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure what type of questions to ask versus what type of questions I would ask tarot.
Mm-hmm.
So when I did my readings, I would then ask for clarification and additional information using the tarot.
Mm-hmm.
And they seemed to kind of work together. And then when I went and found the additional information, I found that it was pretty accurate. So I used mirroring and pairing when I was doing 3-card readings.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I think that blending card systems is like really useful for a lot of folks. And I say, why not? Does anyone remember comparative tarot back in the day? This would have been like the late 90s, early 2000s. This was like a big thing. And actually there was a comparative tarot deck. I love the hand reaching into Sophia's backgrounds. So it would be like, you would use a Waite-Smith deck, for example, but you would use like 4 different decks and you would compare the imagery in each. So like, let's say you drew a card, you drew the Ace of Wands, then you would draw the Ace of Wands from like 4 different decks and read, comparatively. So that was a thing that was really popular when I was starting to read.
I'm in a tarot group, so we do that sometimes, and there'll be like 6 of us with 6 different decks, and we'll just compare them, contrast, talk about how you saw what you saw when you use that card for this reading, and it's definitely interesting. Or we'll do a whole reading and we'll all pull out all the cards.
Yeah. It's amazing the things that even like I don't necessarily use multiple decks when I read, but when I pull a card or when I do a reading, I'll often think like an image from another deck will pop into my head. And I'll say like, oh yeah, in this deck, like it has this image on it. And like, that makes me think of this. So there's definitely benefit to all our like deck gluttony, which is like really nuanced readings. And I'll justify my deck buying, although I haven't really bought any this week. I almost bought a deck that was on sale, and I don't remember the name of it. And then I saw that it was coming from the UK, and the shipping was more than the deck, and so I didn't buy it. But you know, that's how it goes with international shipping, which is a total scam.
Tax
I almost
deductible,
did
right?
that with a Lenormand deck last night. Exact same thing. It was shipping from the UK, so it was like, maybe I'll hold off on that for now.
Sorry, shipping in Canada is ridiculous. Like if I ship something to my best friend in the next province over, and we live in the Maritimes, so they're small provinces, it's at least $20 for like the smallest box you can find. And if you're shipping in from the States or UK, like there was a couple decks that I bought recently, and I ended up getting a mail forwarding service set up in the US because it would have cost me $40 in shipping. And that's like ridiculous. So I hear you with that. 100%. It's so frustrating, even within Canada, but definitely internationally.
Yeah. Damn, Canada. We're supposed to all envy Canada.
I don't know, the more I look at it, the less there is to envy, for sure. The whole healthcare crisis here in Nova Scotia, like there's 2 people that have passed away in ERs in the last 2 weeks due to like staffing shortages and not getting care and stuff like that. So anyway.
That's devastating. All right, well, on that note, let's talk about card reading.
Way to be a downer, sorry.
No, it's a good point. I think, you know, especially for progressives in the United States, like, you know, we love to hold Canada up as, you know, as the example of how to do it. And every Canadian I know is like, well.
Yeah, no, we're really not, unfortunately.
Yeah. So let's talk about some cards just from a functional. Can you see my screen? Yes. And my computer is not charging for some reason. I don't want it to die during this. All right, here we go. All right, Ruby. So let's start with the cross, because did we talk about the cross last time? I don't think we did. So the cross is an interesting one because it's normal meaning, its traditional meaning is burdens, which I find really interesting from like a Euro sort of Christian centric like culture, you know what I mean? Like the idea that they go to that rather than some kind of religious connotation. Well, I think the reason why it's a burden is the idea of carrying the cross, right, in that sort of biblical sense, but that they went to that. Also, I guess feels very German somehow, you know what I mean? Like it feels very German to go to that sort of like heavy, dark place rather than like, you know, in France, it would have been like, you know, bright, beautiful, you know, salvation. So, but what, I mean, let's try to sort of preempt the biblical and sort of say, prior to us understanding the cross as a religious symbol, what was it? Or let me ask it this way. Go ahead, sorry, Justin.
Well, it's the cross is actually like a mandala. It's a you know, it's a centering point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a lot of cultures where that image, prior to, you know, Christianity, the sort of intersection of these two straight lines, even sort of mathematically, is kind of a spiritual thing for sure.
Yeah.
And if we look at the way like symbols have been contaminated throughout history, you know what I mean? The swastika, for example, though sort of appalling to us today, is a Buddhist symbol that was co-opted. And actually in my hometown where I grew up in Massachusetts, which was a big textile manufacturing, the swastika was actually sewn into fabrics as an indication of what kind of fabric it was or where it came from. So this very sort of convoluted, you know, this I guess is where we get into like the cultural association of the symbol and then the reality of it. For those of us who sort of know the biblical associations, you know, why is the cross a symbol to Christians today?
Well, the crucifixion, the cross to bear.
Yeah. And the crucifixion was, so where I'm getting at is like the cross would have been contemporarily the equivalent of the electric chair.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on which cross, you know, because if you're looking at like a crucifix, that's more like kind of morbid and And this is definitely cultural, but non-Catholics, for instance, don't do crucifix. So the cross to them, like an empty cross, actually symbolizes the risen Christ, because he's not on the cross anymore. He's
right.
So
Yeah. I was just sort of digging into why it's a symbol today, right? You know what I mean? Sort of like what it was. It was an execution device. You know what I mean? Because even those of us, I grew up Catholic. That's no secret. But the story is that there were two other people crucified at the same time. The thing that made Jesus an exception was that he was nailed rather than tied. You know what I mean? So people were tied to crucifixes and left to die. So you know what I mean? It was a torture device, essentially, is sort of where I'm getting at, in that realm. That's why we know it as a symbol in Christianity today, because had it been something else, we wouldn't use that. You know what I mean? So that's kind of where I was getting at, is that it actually makes sense that the object does get associated with burden, because it was sort of a capital punishment tool. So, but it does have a symbol as well. You know what I mean? And so it has a religious connotation. It has, a sense of faith to it, a sense of belief, a sense of dedication. And so I was thinking, in a sense, it can represent that burden. It can represent torture, but it could also represent just believing as a generic idea, you know what I mean? Or believing in or having faith in a sense. Do we have any thoughts, about like equivalence today? Like I sort of drew the very clumsy line between this and an electric chair, which, might appall my parents. But are there other lines we can draw between it as an idea, as a tool, as a thing, and today?
I almost feel like anything that shows up as a reminder of something that you're carrying with you, like sobriety coins, or like anything that is a marker of work having been invested in something, and the constant need to check in and reflect and be reminded of something that you're trying to overcome, or something that you're carrying with you.
That's a great line. I love that.
Yeah, I keep thinking of that expression, "not my cross to bear."
So this is one where we kind of have a pretty modern concept of it in a way, weirdly. But I do like the idea of like a token indicating sort of a commitment to, or, work done, or, labor achieved. That's cool. Let's look at the garden. Did we talk about the garden last time? I don't think we did. I can't remember. Let's look at the garden, regardless. So the garden traditionally represents community, groups of people, etc. So that's a fairly traditional interpretation of it. But again, I like to strip away the assumed and look at the literal. And I always have lots of thoughts about this card, but I'm curious. What is a garden? And if were we to answer these questions, who, what, when, where, why, where, pretty clear. But what thoughts do we have about the garden beyond it sort of being told, it's supposed to represent community?
Cultivation.
Yeah, growth, nourishment.
Yeah, I was going to say sustenance. And if it's like a vegetable garden, it would be like physical sustenance. But if it's a flower garden, it would be more like soul sustenance or spiritual sustenance.
It feels like a place of renewal. And in a lot of big cities, like I lived in Halifax for a while, and the Halifax Public Gardens are like one of the central green spaces downtown. And you think about Central Park, and when you're in a big city full of hustle and bustle and not as many green spaces, that can be a central place of kind of reconnection and nourishment and growth.
Yeah, I was kind of going toward the connection to kind of more grounded or connected to earth, as like those who keep a garden, rather, appreciating the growth process rather than going to the store and buying it.
Hmm.
There's also like a manipulation of nature.
Thanks for saying that.
And yeah, like an interplay between like, well, we're trying to control it, make it look this way, make it act this way.
Yeah, that was my thought. And that's often how I tend to read this card when I read with it, is sort of something manicured, designed, manipulated. You all are much more or much less cynical than I am. But I do, I think about, for example, if we were to compare the garden with the tree, you know what I mean? The garden is not a natural occurrence. It is a designed or planned occurrence of nature, and so to me, there's just that interesting element of it being nature imposed upon, or nature designed or nature controlled. And so I definitely feel what Leslie said, that sort of idea of manipulated space.
Can I just add in? It depends on what kind of a gardener
Absolutely.
you are.
Yeah.
For sure. And
you can grow that.
Like your garden is on your property and your property has an end, or you know what I mean? Like there is always some sort of guardrails put up on a garden, even if it's naturally growing within the confines.
That's a great point too. Liz is an herbalist, and so she has a relationship to gardens and nature that is much more healthy than mine. Because and I guess part of that comes too from like the context of the time, right? Like we're thinking about sort of 18th century Europe, where like a garden wasn't just a manipulated space, but also a sign of privilege. You know what I mean? It was a spot designed to indicate how you could afford natural, So they were often designed, like the European garden is designed to be very symmetrical and planned. But, there's today, like, for example, the movement of sort of native gardens where you don't plant what isn't natural to the particular landscape. And so to Liz's point, the kind of garden it is, and the cards around it can tell you, you know what I mean, what kind of garden we're dealing with, for sure. So, let's talk about the fish. So the fish is traditionally the money card, and the card of abundance, which kind of makes sense. I see, and also anything liquid or fluid, which I think might be where, we get the idea of fish representing money as being something liquid, you know what I mean? Fluid, flowing. But what other associations can we make of the fish?
Fish travel in schools. So it's a nice metaphor for having to work with other people. Kind of what is your role within that school of fish? I think it represents office culture, especially the more traditional office setting where people are in their cubicles. Like, I think that's typically where we get the whole fish is work connotation.
Yeah. And I see this as a lot. This to me sort of represents groups maybe more than the garden one, or communities more than the garden one, for exactly that reason, like schools of things, but also school. You know what I mean? So like I did a reading at one point where the fish came up and I was like, oh, it's school. It's literally class. It's literally school. Which I guess is one reason why I think it's nice to be open to possibilities of cards rather than sort of limiting it to, oh, the fish means money. Because when we are open to the potential of it, I think we get more readings, or more nuance. It's funny. I was sort of scrolling through Facebook this week and I saw, does anyone know the card reader and card designer Paris de Bono?
Yeah.
He has a deck called the Lenormand deck, which is a 20 card Lenormand. Whitney, you're on mute if you were saying something.
Just thinking, I'm about to take a note on that and look it up.
Okay, yeah. Harris DeBono. He's on Facebook. I think his YouTube channel too. But it's a 20 card Lenormand deck that he kind of reduced similar cards. Like I think he combined the bird, stork, and maybe another one. So it's interesting. I was thinking of picking up because he has a couple decks that he designed. But then I was also like, one of the problems that I have with Lenormand is that I feel like there aren't enough colors in it sometimes. And so like to reduce it even further to me is really interesting. So I don't know, but I may at some point. But there's a Facebook group that he has that I joined this week to just sort of spy and see, how people read with it. Because I'm just curious about divination techniques anyway. But any other thoughts on the fish? All right. Let's move on to talking about techniques. So what I have done is kind of highlighted this week just a few different things that I wanted to talk about. And we can play with these, throughout. And that's why I said, if you have any kind of pop culture or in the news questions we can play with, that'll be helpful for us to experiment with this. So there's the 3-card reading, which we are familiar with from all kinds of systems. Usually you don't really have positioned spreads in cartomancy, which sort of this falls under. But I have seen sort of the subject action modifier and subject action acted on technique with using these cards. And so the idea being that like the first card drawn is the subject, the second card would be the verb or the action, and then the third card would be the modifier, the descriptor, or the thing that's acted on. And that's an interesting thing, I think, to play with, to give structure, especially for folks who are used to working with positional spreads or really enjoy working with positional spreads, because it gives context and it gives a bounding box to the cards, which to me feels familiar, from other divination systems that we may be more familiar with. I tend to feel a little hamstrung by this, but that's me. And if you know me by now, you know that like positional spreads are not something I traditionally work with. But I like the idea of this. So for example, if we were to look at the writer, heart, and book, it would be the writer is the subject. So it represents the thing the reading is about. And then the verb would be the heart, the thing that it's doing. And then the book would be how it's doing it in the first example. So it's the writer does the heart in the way of the book. And I'm curious, even without a question, how could we interpret that sort of sentence? Just thinking about what we've talked about the last week and this morning, going back to function, form, the idea of the thingness of the thing. How could we read that sentence, make it into language?
Travel is essential to pass information. Something
okay,
like that.
So talk about how you got there.
Well, so the writer is about traveling. The heart is like crucial. It's a very kind of essential element of your body. And the book is about information. So, like traveling is, I guess not travel, but maybe like communication too is essential for passing information.
Okay. So let's fit that into the sort of the structure of this.
That was winging it. Sorry.
No, that's fine. This is an experiment. This is a lab. We're playing around. There's no wrong answer. My job as a facilitator in this case is to sort of, bring us into the technique, this particular technique. So the subject then becomes travel, right? Travel is the subject, or communication becomes the subject. How is it? I'm sorry. Travel also feels like an action to me. So that's where I'm sort of like, the action would be the heart in this case. So travel is, what does it do?
Oh, true. That's true. Yeah. See, I didn't think of that.
No, that's fine. But let's tease it out. What?
I said I'm still reading like tarot cards, it's
And what you said is a perfectly legitimate interpretation of these three cards. I just want to sort of like coax us into this structure. We're going to have more freedom later on to ignore the structure. I just want to play around with this. So travel, let's just take travel as the subject. Then the action becomes the heart. So what does the heart do?
I mean, it keeps things going,
Okay, so travel keeps going. Travel generates maybe, or what's another word for keeps? Sustains.
Yeah, sustains.
Travel sustains, and then book.
It's like knowledge or information.
So travel sustains our learning, our knowledge, which is
like, think of there's an old sayings like you can know everything without looking through the window, but the further one goes, the less one knows, or whatever. I don't know. It's like something like, you learn by traveling. You can't learn staying in the same place.
It's a great sentence, and it fits our structure here. So travel sustains learning is a perfect sentence for this trio. So let's try. All right. Does anyone have any other thoughts on this one?
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So how I was seeing this was someone is coming in with like a heartfelt message.
Yeah,
because perhaps they've received some information. So like, say for example, like it's a Mercury retrograde. We know what happens in Mercury retrograde. Someone's ex saw that they were moving on or something, or saw a picture of them happy with someone new. So they feel compelled to come back into this person's life and shake things up, or be like, oh, I've always cared about you, something like that. Like that's very typical.
Mm-hmm. Let's fit that into the structure too, because that's good, but that makes heartfelt an adjective. So it makes the heartfelt not the verb. The coming into is the verb, which isn't a card here, unless we make the writer the verb, which we could do.
Yeah.
But let's take what you just said and use these three cards to sort of fit that into subject, action, and modifier. So the subject is what?
The subject, that messenger.
Okay.
So I guess the subject would be the X in the situation.
Yeah.
And
so the X is the messenger or the writer. Cool. So they're doing what?
So they would be confessing their feelings, or it's like saying something about feelings. And then the modifier would be that information that they got.
Okay. So the heart becomes expressing feeling. Got it.
Yes.
And then the message, the book is the message. So the heartfelt message is the book, but the heart is expressing the message.
Yes.
Got it. Anyone else?
I was kind of looking at it as the person who's moving through their emotions or feelings. That process leads them to a deeper understanding of themselves and the situation. Like the book is all about knowledge. And if you look at the heart as an action, it's like engaging with whatever feelings are around the situation, emotions around the situation. And the writer as the active agent is someone who wants to actively push through that rather than avoid or resist.
Mm-hmm. The hard part about that's good. I didn't mean to not validate that. That's great. The hard part about this is that the writer is the active card. It's just not in the active position.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is a thing that we see in tarot too. You know what I mean? There are sometimes passive cards that fall into the active position, which as readers, sometimes is helpful and sometimes it's not. I'm being a little more pedantic about this just because I want to sort of highlight the techniques as they are before we start to mess with them. Just to give a little pat on the head to the pedantic people who are like, this is the wrong way and you're ruining Lenormand. I'm ruining everything, but let's work within the bounding box for a second. Let's try the subject action acted on with that first row of cards. So writer, heart, book. So the first two stay the same. The writer is the subject, the heart is the action, but the book then becomes the thing that's acted on. The receiver of the action. Sophia?
I think that's what I tried to do the first time. I think I jumped ahead because I think what I tried to do makes way more sense as the book is like a secondary modifier.
That makes sense for sure. Yep. And you don't, I want to be clear, you don't have to do it this way. I just want to explore this thing. So, any other thought? Does changing the book to the recipient of the action change the reading much for anyone else? So if we take Justin's example, for instance, so it was like travel sustains learning. In this case, the book is acted on, so the heart is doing something to the book. So it almost is the same in a way, you know, because like the syntax, like travel, it's sustaining the knowledge. The knowledge is the recipient of the sustaining. So it's not that different a shift, you know what I mean?
If you had like a question to filter it or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Some specifics.
And it's rare. I think this is a rule that is common in Lenormand that I would say is that you would rarely have ever do a Lenormand question without reading without a question. And as someone who really doesn't like doing tarot readings without a question, I second that as necessary. But again, I don't believe in rules. So do whatever the hell you want, because that's what we're here for. How about the second one? So stars as the subject, mice as the action, and clouds as the modifier. So the subject is stars, mice is the action, and clouds is the modifier.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was thinking my initial response was hope is being worn away by doubt.
Yes, I see that. Hope worn away by doubt. Because the action is being worn away. Doubt is modifying the action. Yes. I buy that.
I saw the opposite.
Tell me.
Hope destroys confusion or insecurities.
Oh,
yeah.
That's also a great reading. Right. Hope eats away at the insecurity or confusion. Nice. This is why context is so key. You know what I mean? And why a question matters so much. But those are both really valid interpretations, I would say. Again, a pedantic Lenormand reader might disagree with me, but I don't care what they think. Anyone else? All right, let's try with a question. Let's actually go with the William and Harry thing, because that came up. So let's say, will William and Harry reconcile this year? So now we have to let's work with the second three, the stars, mice, clouds. So now we have to contextualize that in a question. We know the current state, but we don't know what's possible because it's the beginning of the year, and who knows with those crazy royals. So subject action acted on. So we're still working on, or a subject action modifier. We're still working in the syntax, but now we're asking a question of whether they'll reconcile this year. So one thing I always say in my classes is don't worry about being right, worry about getting a clear, logical answer based on the cards. So let's not worry about whether it's right or wrong. Just for anyone to remind them about last week, or anyone who didn't watch last week, one thing about predicting, especially world events or things that are going on, is that things change so rapidly. And the Kevin McCarthy hearings were an example of that, that things kept changing. And so as a fortune teller, it's like, I'm not really worried about being right. I'm worried about being right now, because who the hell knows what's going to change. But will they be able to reconcile this year? I can say there are ways of answering this question when I do yes or no involving the suits, that the black suits indicate no and the red suits indicate yes, but let's not worry about that right now. So stars, mice, clouds, what do we think?
Okay, I'm just gonna wing it.
Yeah.
Because, okay. So the first thing that popped into my head was the group sort of worries because he's unpredictable. So because I'm not super familiar with Lenormand meetings, and I'm going based on what I heard previously, which is the group. So the group is sort of anxious about his unpredictable behavior. He doesn't fall in line like William does. So I'm going to say no.
Mm-hmm.
They still have concerns over his unpredictability.
Mhm.
He's not trustworthy because he's already shown that he doesn't play ball. He won't play ball.
Yeah.
So
So the group is the stars.
yeah, exactly. So it's like the group, and that can be representative of like British aristocracy, or like that whole cluster of, and it's like that high society culture in Britain. They're very nervous about him because he's disrupting things and he's unpredictable.
Mhm.
So to me, he's not trustworthy. He doesn't fit in that group anymore.
I can see the clouds as unpredictable for sure, and sort of not being clear, not seeing. I hadn't thought about the mice as anxious. The birds are usually associated with anxiety, but I can see them as these sort of like little, like crinkly little anxious little things. So I can see that for sure too.
I think that's the traditional meaning of them, but again, I know you said not to. That's just going based on what I know.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could also see this.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention, I'm looking at the stars also, and just trying to kind of expand my thinking. The stars as them, as Megan and whoever is, as being stars, that their stardom is very busily clouding things or keeping things in a negative light.
Yeah.
Clouding things over.
Yeah, the stars as fame I really like, or as celebrity, and that seems really apt here for sure too. So that's a nice. Yeah. Sophia?
I was going along the same vein. Stars as celebrity makes a lot of sense, but I think that hope of reconciliation is being eaten away by the obscurity that's just inherent in that kind of institution.
Mm-hmm.
That there is that kind of veil of secrecy, and that seems to be something that Harry and Meghan really are very against, is the sort of stiff upper lip culture of the British aristocracy. The obscurity, maybe the lack of obscurity, it's the fact that the firm wouldn't promise to protect Meghan and their children. So I think it could be twofold. Either it's obscurity as in eaten away by the lack of obscurity that they wanted, or it's obscured by just this austere nature inherent in the firm.
That's great. Nice. I love sorry, Jules, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just thinking like the stars is almost also like with the idea of celebrity, there's a
I think I lost you for a sec.
The things that were happening on the surface is eating away at that kind of veil of respectability and veil of like stiff upper lip, never complain, never explain, all of that nonsense. Well, not nonsense, it's bringing things to light that wouldn't have come to light otherwise. And that's kind of eating away at any possibility for reconciliation because it's just not done. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I missed a little bit of the beginning of that because there was a little cut. I don't know if anyone else heard that, but the second half made sense.
Yeah, I was just looking at the stars as bringing to light or bringing to visibility through the idea of celebrity or being seen, the things that were previously hidden.
That's great. I love the mice in an interesting way. I do tend to read them in the way that they're traditionally read, which is sort of like eating at. But I was listening to NPR the other day, as all white liberals are required to do, and there was an interview with an author called Pests. The book was called Pests, not the author, and it was about how humans actually create pests, because pests are just existing and living their best lives, and we're creating the conditions under which they become pests. Like house mice didn't really exist before houses. You know what I mean? And now they're just trying to get warm and find food. And we call in the exterminators. And so there's something interesting about the mice to me as a pest, as a like weeds, exactly, as a thing that is bad, but contextually only because we are both freaked out by them and created the conditions under which they freak us out. which is just a very human thing. I actually like mice. I don't mind them. Rats, I hate, but mice, I have zero problem. But anyway, just a digression. Any other thoughts about this trio and the old brothers, William and Harry?
What you said about creating the conditions was really interesting because, you know, the argument is that there was lots of attempts at communication and reconciliation, and it wasn't until things reached a certain point that the breaking point happened. And if you look at the mice as that kind of something that only exists because the conditions were established for it to be there, then that kind of impacts the situation as well.
Yeah, that's great. Really cool. All right, let's jump into a slightly more nuanced technique, which I find much more interesting, which is the 5-card layout. This I have used in Marseille and now all tarot readings since I learned it. This is a fairly common Lenormand technique, but I think I initially picked this up from J.M. David's Marseille book, which I love and is one of my top 3 favorite Marseille books, or not. I can't remember, but I think it came from him. This is a 5-card layout where the first card that goes down is the middle, and we looked at this a little bit at the end of last week, but we're going to look at it more formally this time. We look at it. So you lay out the middle card, and then the one to the left of it, then to the right of it, and then the far left of it, and the far right of it. And then you can read it in layers. So you can read it sort of as the first 3 cards that go down. And then you can read it, see these lines that I put here. So you can do 1, 2, 3, and you can do 1, 2, 3, meaning 4, 2, 1. This is where things get confusing. And you can do 1, 2, 3 as 1, 3, 5. And you can do then mirroring. So you can mirror 2 and 3 together, and 4 and 5 together. So what you're really doing is not unlike the box spread that we're going to look at in a minute. And if you know the box spread from different readings I've done or videos I've made, you basically read all the combos that are available to you. This gives you a lot of information, and it gives you a lot of nuance. Where I think this gets worrisome and anxiety making for folks is that it is a lot of information. But what I think the key is to let the initial spreads, the initial readings, contextualize and restrict the rest of them. So your first 3 kind of give you the bounding box that you're going to work in. And then everything else kind of fits in there, unless it doesn't, which is sort of the caveat. So my phone, I'm using my phone as my webcam right now. Just to give you an example, if you didn't see it, you can go look at it later. On my Instagram, I did a reading right before this about William and Harry, and I did the exact question we just worked with. Will they reconcile? And it was the house, the clouds, the bear, the scythe, and the tree. And to me, the answer was the scythe and the tree. Like, that told me everything I really needed to know. Everything else kind of gave me some nuance, but the scythe and the tree was like, you cut down the family tree. You've really severed the roots. And so that made me say, no, it's, and then the house, the clouds, and the bear kind of said this big powerful family is in chaos, sort of like what we said last time. But the scythe and the tree really answered everything I needed to know there. So you can read all these layers, is my point, but you don't have to read all these layers. If you get the answer that you need, everything else is just gravy. You know what I mean? It can give you shading, it can give you color, it can give you nuance, which is the thing that I have traditionally found Lenormand lacks. But that's just me. But I do find that, it can tell you, like, if a yes or no question comes up, I used to sort of avoid yes or no questions because I felt like, it's not very interesting. And what I found was, like, I don't mind them anymore. But most people don't want yes or no, they want to know why. And so you can get the yes or no pretty quickly, I think, but then the why, is where these different combos come in. So, if we're working with a question, we start with the first 3 cards, Lily, Sun, Clover. And then we can go on and read Key Lily's sun, clover, birds. I don't know why I have the broom and the whip there for some reason, but that's birds. And then we can read lilies and clover and key and birds. So that's a thing that we can do too. So, you know, there's a whole layer there that we can work with. So let's experiment. Let's play around. Who has something that we can read about? Again, something, you know, it could be a fairy tale or anything or something in the news. I mean, we could do the stupid documents in Biden's stupid garage, or anything, you know, something less infuriatingly irritating. Any thoughts?
I find the documents to be somewhat entertaining at this point.
It's like the way that Democrats will inevitably shoot themselves in the fucking foot no matter. It's like they don't even have a gun in their hands. And they'll fucking shoot themselves in the foot. All right, let's read about that. So how will this turn out? Now, this isn't really a reading because these aren't cards drawn, but you know, the sun is always a good sign, but let's think about context in this case. Context is not, when I think about the sun in my case, I think about a spotlight, and I think about heat. And so this is not necessarily the attention that the administration wants, right? So contextually, the sun may not be a great card, but what do we think?
I would agree with spotlight. It seems like there's some, or we could be very literal and say that it's been brought to light.
Mm-hmm.
We could think of it that way. I don't see the sun as positive here at all. Like it's definitely some sort of illumination. Mm-hmm. What can we say? We love consistency, and the DNC is consistent.
Excellent. So how does the sun play with the lilies and the clover? There's a really interesting relationship to me that sticks out immediately, but I'm curious if anyone else feels it.
Perhaps this is a situation that's developing. We think of the lily as that like maturity card. It's kind of that like it's blooming. So this information is coming to light. This situation is unfolding, unfurling like the flower. And then it seems like maybe their luck is going to be changing as a result.
Interesting. Yeah, I like the clovers as luck. Is there another connection between the clovers and the sun that we can make?
Well, literally, plants need the sun to grow. So I thought it was interesting that you had the sun in the middle and two plants on either side of it.
Yeah. And to sort of, it sort of reinforces what Sophia said about the lily,
Right.
But it spreads pretty fast. You know, the clover. So their luck may be about to change. Whatever is happening is like it's covering a lot. It's spreading a lot. Mm-hmm. What happens as we look at key, lilies, and sun? When we read this way, we don't have to stick with the original interpretation too, by the way. So like the sun had that sort of spotlight quality. It may not be that when we look at it in the context of the key lilies and the sun, because for the moment, the clover and the birds don't exist to us. So we contextualize it in the sense of key, lily, sun. So what's a key? What's it for?
Opens up.
It opens up, it unlocks. So something's unlocking, something's being unlocked. The lilies and the sun are doing that.
It's kind of hard to keep the moral high ground when you're doing the same thing that you're calling out others for. Not that it's to the same extent or even the same context, but that's how it's kind of being marketed or put forward by, let's say, the Fox Newses of the world.
So the moral high ground then being the lilies, that sort of purity test.
Yeah.
And the sun fits in as what, the exposure, or?
Yeah, drawing light to something that detractors will use as, you know, material to try and prove that the ethics and moral high ground that came into play when the document seizure happened, you know, it's opening up that kind of discussion, so whether it's valid or not.
Yeah, this is unlocking a purity test of exposure. The sun is tricking me here. I'm struggling with the sun in this trio. to contextualize it, honestly.
I would also, the Fox Newses, and they love the ageism angle, love it. So this could open Biden up again for more of those ageism instances where it's opening him up for the spotlight to be put on. Oh, Grandpa Biden forgot the documents in his garage, whoopsie daisy. And it casts that like whole, I think the ageism is ridiculous, but it really opens him up for that again. And it talks about, like, it brings up the issue of competence, because they may take the angle of, well, him having the documents can't even be malicious. It's more of a statement of incompetence. So perhaps that.
I see the lilies as sort of like the old way of doing things, the old guard. The key is kind of like, you're opening. What I think of is like the tactics that they employed and what they viewed to be kind of a very extreme situation, kind of like a total warfare against Trump. I think that, like, so once they opened the door to going after Trump for like the documents, that it's like a door that can't be closed. So it's like the old way of doing things is altered by that. It's almost like a karmic situation. It's like, does that make sense or not?
I know it does. I think it does.
Yeah, it's kind of just like, like you can't, like, once they employed that kind of tactic to go after Trump, for things that rarely have ever been like made a big deal of, like there was always this like serious amount of privilege that came with being president, and so it's like what's good for the goose is good for the gander kind of thing. Like they opened that door, so now it's going to come back to bite them. You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense, but
it makes sense. And I think that lilies is kind of the old way. Definitely tracks for me. The sun, again, I'm having a hard time with. You know what I mean? As a interpretation in these, the key and the lily are kind of, and all of these interpretations are kind of hitting for me, but the sun I'm having a hard time tracking. And
it's like it's the spotlight, like you said. That's the way I see it. It's just like everything's being watched now, because total war situation. So it's just like, I don't know.
So this has opened up or exposed the old way.
Political warfare, yeah. It's just political warfare situation. It's like the spotlight's constantly going to be on little things that both parties are serious hypocrites, and they both do things like, I don't know. That's just the way I say it, but without getting but so I just see it as like a karmic situation, It's like he opened that door to kind of
put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Yeah, exactly. So now, like, it's just going to be back and forth constantly, and it's just going to go on and on and
on. Danielle in the chat wrote, "Could the sun indicate that this is going to keep going until or through the summer?" That's a great point.
Yeah, the repetition of the sun, right? That cyclical nature, it just keeps coming back.
Yeah, relentless.
Yeah.
How about sun clover birds?
Oh, before we move on, I don't know if I believe in this like line of thinking, but the sun can be transparency, the lilies can be maturity. Is there something to be said about the fact that this was such a different situation from Trump, the key being like that they were very open about it, very upfront and mature in the handling, and that could turn the situation? I mean, I don't know that the other cards support that, but
it's a great question, and it's a far less cynical response than I have.
Like the garden.
Right. No, for sure. We could. I mean, I've been focusing on sun, on rather Key Lily's sun, but you could read Sun Lily's Key. And so there's a reading of that where, like, exposing this sort of these old things could be the key to solving it for sure. How about sun clover birds?
Perhaps this being on the forefront is meant to be a distraction from some other chatter that's happening, because I am not a tinfoil hat person, but it seems very random. So perhaps this is supposed to draw the spotlight somewhere else so that a cover up can occur in a different area.
So the chatter is the birds, the cover up is the clover, and the sun is the spotlight. Nice.
Yeah.
I like that one.
Yeah, that clover as cover is really, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. How about if we mirror lilies and clover? How do those two play together?
That I also saw as the cover up. I did the mirroring first because I forgot that this side of it was a thing.
Mhm.
I forgot that we go the other way as well. So I saw the clover as the covering up of what's unfurling. So that's where I got my line of thinking for the other one.
That's great. Yeah, the relationship between lilies and clover is interesting. It's hard to sort of facilitate and read, by the way. So I'm sort of like, I don't have a good answer as I'm looking at this, which normally I do because I'm more familiar with other systems. But, you know, lilies and clover to me, both being sort of like fed by the sun is so interesting. But I'm thinking about like I do think about this sort of like musty purity spread, you know, this musty like purity, you know, like, oh, the virgin documents, they have to be protected, you know, this sort of like pearl clutching that people do is sort of spreading. And then key and birds, to me, sort of presents a solution, but I'm curious what you're thinking.
Well, I think too, the difference between the lily and the clover, that lily is cultivated, whereas the clover grows wild.
So there's like a tug of war.
Yeah.
Jules asked in the chat, there are a lot of diamonds in this reading. Does that come into play at all? It sure can. Different readers use the insets in different ways. Camellia Elias would say, you know, that the diamonds would mean like maybe yes, and hearts are definitely yes. So you think about a positive outcome. This could be a positive outcome regardless of what the other cards are, because we have 4 diamonds. You know, so regardless of what happens, this will be a positive outcome for them, which can help color the reading. You know what I mean, and contextualize the cards. So for example, I said that the sun didn't feel like it was positive in this case, but the diamonds could suggest that the reading overall is fairly positive. And so in that case, you could say that this coming to light might actually be beneficial for the administration. So there's a context in which we could use the card insets to tell us whether this is a positive or negative reading for the querent. In this case, it's positive, and so then it contextualizes the spread to me in a way where the sun probably is positive. The sun is generally considered positive in Lenormand anyway, and so this may expose some sort of festering things, you know, and that the key is talking about them. Like if Biden, for example, makes everything public, you know, and says, "Oh, you know, here's the documents, here's what was in them," for example, then he sets the tone for someone who is notoriously never revealing anything willingly. So, you know, that's a great point, Jules, and a great thing for us to think about contextually, that the card insets are there for a reason. Even if we don't read the playing cards, the insets can be useful. Liz, you came off mute for a sec. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. What about the aspect for the birds card, the gossip aspect of it? Because that's one of the associations that I have with this card. I don't, you know, I'm really a newbie at Lenormand, but that was one of the meanings I always thought about birds, is it's, you know, gossiping. And I'm thinking about, you know, the right wing reaction. And I think, was it Sophia that said the whole ageism thing, that they'll frame it in that way? So they'll take like this sort of gossipy approach of, you know, trying to make Biden look incompetent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gossipy and chattery talking, like the birds are the talking cards. So like talking about it to me feels like that's where I said like this presents a solution, the key in the birds. The solution is talking about it. So rather than hiding it, so the tendency with the clover, maybe you want to cover it up, but the key is not to cover it up. The key is to talk a lot about it. And we may end up finding out, what the Clintons have hidden. Oh my God. Just wait until we find out what's on their hard drive. So this is a good. I will also say too that it's much easier to read this way when you actually choose cards rather than me positioning them. But I want to just highlight the techniques. So now let's take a break because we're at the halfway point. So we'll just take 3 to 4 minutes, go get some water, go pee, whatever you feel like spending 3 minutes doing, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the 9 card. All righty. So welcome back. So this is the 9 card, which we're going to talk through all the sort of ways you can read it, and then we'll add in the concept of houses, and then we'll be ready to sort of think about the grand tableau next week. But we'll sort of start working with pieces of it anyway. And so the 9 card spread is read in many, many combinations, as many combinations really as you want to. So we'll kind of go through the different ways you read it, and then we have some examples, and then we can sort of play around with some actual readings. Any thoughts or questions before we transition into this? Alrighty. So the obvious way to read this is to read each row and each column. So that's sort of the traditional beginning. When I do this, I put the first card in the middle and the second card in the top left, and then the rest out. But that's just, I don't know where I learned that, but it's just what I learned. And I usually read the middle card as kind of the theme or the sort of beginning of the answer. But you can do just as it's laid out here, which is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you read all the rows, you read all the columns, and then the rest are kind of optional techniques that you may or may not need. I find that I don't need them very often. Sometimes they add a little bit of color or something interesting, and sometimes they don't. So, I feel like whatever kind of deck I'm reading with, this is my go-to spread because I like that I have a lot of options, but that I usually find the answer I need just by reading the rows and the columns. But it's very similar to the one we just looked at. So the next thing you can do is read the exterior cards, the bounding cards. So 1, 3, 9, and 7, you would read as like a square. So you can read each corner. Another common thing, and maybe even more common, is to read the diamond. So that would be cards 2, 6, 8, and 4. And again, that's kind of the way they're kind of read clockwise usually. So that's why I sort of said them that way. So 2, 6, 8, and 4. So that's another technique that is common and popular. And then there's knighting, which is a chess move. And this is just one example of it. So you sort of start with a card, and then you move over 1 or 2 and down 1 or 2, depending on where you are. So this one moves over 1 and down 2, so that then you read 2 and 9 together. So that's knighting, because it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. These two knight each other. But 9 also knights 4, so you could read 9 and 4 together. 2 also knights 7, so you can read 2 and 7 together. 7 knights 3, so does it? No, 6. 7 knights 6. So you can read all these combinations. Again, you don't have to. They're just sort of more nuanced, interesting things that you may or may not use. I find that, again, they're kind of my last thing that I'll go to. I use knighting maybe more than reading the corners or the diamond, but that's just me. It's just what sort of jumps into my head in the middle of a reading when I feel like I need more info. So, these are all possibilities. Questions, thoughts? All right, so let's look at like a spread of cards again, so that we're all looking at the same thing. Here's a set of 9. And so again, we just need a topic or a question to read about, and it can be anything. Someone throw something out for me so I don't have to think of one.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about, for current events, Lisa Marie Presley.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, oh my gosh, she was the daughter of Elvis and the wife of Michael Jackson, and then her son committed suicide. So I was thinking, did she die from a broken heart? So I don't know.
That's a deep one. let's work with it. Yeah, she had an interesting and difficult existence. All right, so did she die of a broken heart? So let's start. So we start with the rows. So then we would start with Lily, house, and letter. This is not a situation where it needs to be subject, verb, modifier, or anything like that. We can just sort of read them however they seem to want to be read. It's traditional to go 1, 2, 3, but I don't really think we have to. Sometimes certain cards speak louder, and I think we need to listen to them. So, Lily's house letter. What do we think? And again, it's always good to sort of go back to the foundation. Like, what is this thing I'm looking at rather than what I think I mean? And what does it mean sitting next to this other thing? So, what is a lily? What is a house? What is a letter?
Maybe the integrity or foundation of their family structure was kind of threatened or challenged by the news or reality of her son's suicide. So that created a crack in the foundation.
Sure, yeah. So we have sort of the bad news. I'm just looking at that combo. So just to sort of think critically, it's a little tough to read into those three a sense of bad news. Other than that, we have two spades. So if you're thinking about the spades, bad news, that makes sense. But sort of thinking neutrally, Lily's house letter, they don't necessarily point to the suicide necessarily, for me. But if I'm like off base, let me know.
Yeah, no, not at all. I was just thinking in the context of the potential heartbreak being an impact.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the sort of longevity of their like home was impacted negatively by that news. That makes sense. Any other thoughts?
Unless perhaps the letter is literal.
Mm-hmm.
And that she ended up reading, if there was a letter left behind, that's certainly something that is definitely rocky for people.
Sure.
It's hard. Just to play off what Sophia was saying. So you're thinking like literally a suicide note?
Yeah, in this context, yes.
Yeah.
But I also know that I also have the context of the situation. If
Right.
I didn't have the context, I would not have made that conclusion.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's always the thing about context, right? We can't unknow what we know. Which is one of the reasons why it's helpful to do these things together, because it gives us context that we wouldn't necessarily normally have. So I think again, when we talked about this last week, I said the lilies were always sort of a stuffy, musty flower to me because I associate them with Easter and death and churches, and so I guess there is something to be said about mourning with the lilies. That it was a house of mourning because of that news, because of that situation. And it may, we don't have the context to know whether or not there was a note. So as a reader, I'd sort of hesitate to go there, but it could be like there have been documented things that contribute to the sense of mourning in this house. And the house, I think in this case, might well be the significator of the subject. Also interesting, the sort of question indicated the sun, and the man card shows up in this reading too. And so that's the thing that you kind of want to look at, because theoretically, I think it's possible to read the man and the woman card as not necessarily a person, because a person was brought up in the question. It's a pretty good thing to look at. And they are connected by the corners. So because of that,
Ace of Hearts it's the Ace of Hearts on the man.
Yeah.
So,
there's
again,
also
literal.
Yeah, that emotional like Ace Hearts connection. But the man is connected to the lilies, the letter, the garden by the corners. So we could read that sort of the lilies letter, that sort of sad news in her community, in her world, say about her son, maybe points to that. So this is a good, just to go back to Jules's point earlier, because I sort of started to say, well, I don't get suicide necessarily here and there. When we start to play around with different techniques, and you don't have to go in any order, you can find context, and this does give us that. So if we think of these sad flowers, this sort of memorial letter, the sad news in her world, garden as her environment, about the man, that, you know, that indicates certainly a potential that there was element of a broken heart there, you know. So that's a good way to start, and that gives me something to sort of play with as I work through the rest of the cards. Does that make sense? So it's good to not judge your impulses the way that I did initially, because if you can find evidence in the reading, then you have permission to go with it, if that makes sense. So, all right. So that's just one way of reading the outside and looking for evidence. But any other thoughts on this one, or do we want to go down to book, fish, dog?
I think the last thing I'd want to say about it is that we know that this is a generational thing that has been in her orbit. Her father had issues. Her mother and her father had issues. Michael Jackson was, of course, an individual who had a lot of issues as well with substances and a lot of that stuff. And then I don't know about her son specifically, but it seems like generationally speaking, this metaphorical house, this metaphorical family has this history. So perhaps the lilies here is this long-standing pattern of this bad news that keeps coming up. I don't think it's like a Kennedy's curse situation. I think that generational trauma is just a very real thing.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great interpretation as well. I like that.
Actually, I just have a question.
Yeah.
Where do drugs typically show up in Lenormand?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer, but let's think about the cards that are in the deck. Justin, you're on mute.
Sorry. I was just thinking letter could be a prescription, could be prescriptions. Prescription drugs.
Yeah, it's a great point.
I tend to see the lilies because that type of exotic flower makes me think opium poppy.
I'm just looking through the decks. So we've got like fox, bouquet, sun, mountain. I guess the bear could be too, if you're thinking in contextual, you know, of something being a bear, or the cross. The fish, which are liquid, so that could be substances.
They're an overindulgence kind of card or anything, because alcoholism, I guess, would fall in that category as well. Anything that's,
I mean, it would be combos, right? So like I think about mice and fish, for example, like a lot of something that's eating away at you, or an invader.
The cross tends to be addiction.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, the coffin can be a box of something or containers. So I feel like it would need to be like multiple cards to suggest that.
Sure.
Yeah. That's a good question, though.
Well, because I know she had a history of cocaine use, and, you know, a broken heart can also be a reason why someone abuses drugs.
For sure.
I can't imagine that didn't have an effect on her heart long term. Anyway.
Yeah. All right, what do we get from book, fish, and dog?
Loyal community.
So for folks, you know, we haven't talked about the dog much, but the dog usually represents friends, loyalty. But it can, you know, what is a dog? You know, not even contextually, but Leslie?
Well, a companion. I mean, I know sometimes the book is about like looking for something, or I mean, it's also about secrets sometimes, but I don't know. I feel like she was really looking for a place where she felt understood. Like she had a lot of husbands, partners, looking for that someone to be a companion for her, where she could feel like she was part of some solid family unit, maybe.
There's definitely family in the middle. If we look at the middle row, If we look at, fish as a communal group, we have house, and then the bear is often associated with motherhood. So in this context, the bear we might not read as motherhood in other readings, but this is a reading about a mother who lost a son, and so there's definitely like a feeling there of family. So that definitely contextualizes, Leslie, what you were saying about the fish. You can look at the card above it and below it to justify that in this case the fish represents the family collective, and so you have evidence there. You can contextualize the book with the cards above and below it too. So then the book becomes not just secrets or words, but words or secrets about the lilies and the man. So they're infected by each other in a weird way, which is kind of a strange way to say it, but they're not existing in isolation. They can contextualize each other as much as, so I tend to sort of think in very discrete rows and columns, but you can let the other cards sort of perfume each other. And so, if the book's about these are words or secrets, or I would say thoughts even, because you record thoughts in books, or a diary about this man and his death, represented in this case by the lilies. So that the book, then those secrets, those words, those thoughts, were a center, in her life, being in the row that you just described it, or being center is not a great word, but those thoughts of family and companionship were central. That's a better way to say it, if that makes sense.
I mean, also there's like I know the lilies can represent your father as well.
Oh yeah.
So it's like this legacy of.
Yes. And that brings up a good point. The face cards can also represent people as much as the man and the woman can. So the lilies in this case is the king of spades, and Elvis was the king. So, and the house is the king of hearts. And the fish is the king of diamonds. So we've got a lot of male, dominant male energy.
The king of pop and the king of rock and roll. So.
Oh yeah. I mean, we could literally go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole with meetings, which is why when I say that Lenormand lacks nuance, I'm just being bitchy. You know what I mean? Because clearly it isn't. Any other thoughts about book, fish, and dog? The fish can represent a lot of something to remember, sort of abundance or a lot. So, a lot of thinking about her pal. The books is thinking her thoughts. So she was definitely that was on her mind.
I think of the dog too as something that's kind of always at your heels,
Mm-hmm. Which grief can do.
Right.
I also think of the dog as an animal that had to be tamed. You know what I mean? Like the dog, when I sort of asked the question earlier, like the dog is domesticated. It's not innately a friend of humans. You know what I mean? So there's something, with the dog, it's an animal that has to be domesticated. And so there's a conflict in a way too between, and so in the diamond, we have house, dog, bear, and book. And so we have we have the wild animal and the animal that was tamed, which is interesting, contextually in the house. And then the book becomes like words. I think about words as, talking, but maybe fighting. The bear and the book could sort of suggest sort of strong opinions. So there may have been conflict within this sort of house that was, the safe haven.
And the book speaks to finding something out, learning something that had not been known.
For sure.
Right?
There are readers. I can like hear all the actual really hardcore Lenormand readers listening to us and dying inside. but I want, again, like the thing that's important to me as a reader is not that I follow your rules, but that I get the person I'm reading for a clear answer that's logical. You know what I mean? That's inevitable given the cards that we have on the table. So some readers will look at whether the book is open or closed in their deck. In this case, it's open. Actually, it's a stack of books, but and there are others for whom the picture never matters unless it's where the men and women are looking. So there's another thing there, that the book is open. So you could say it's less secretive in this case.
So Ben, I wanted to ask you, or in the group, so something that is really standing out to me in these 9 cards is there's 3 kings and 3 tens. So as a tarot reader, that would really be significant to me, that there's 3 out of the 4 kings and 3 out of the 4 tens in a 9-card reading. So would you think then you could read like the 3 tens as a thing and the 3 kings as a thing? They
form a cross too.
I'm sorry?
And they form the cross.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
Oh yeah.
Which king is missing and which 10 is missing?
Right. So the king
of diamonds. Oh no, I'm sorry, the king of
clubs. And the 10 of spades.
Yeah. There's a lot to explore, isn't there?
Yeah.
This is amazing, really.
Yeah.
So let's look at the bottom row, because that's really striking. Man, bear, and garden.
So for me, I'm so much more focused on the Ace of Hearts than I am on the actual meaning of the man, because so apparently the cause of death was cardiac arrest, which that's what kind of made me think about, okay, so literally it was a physical heart failure, but was it metaphysically,
right,
a broken heart? And so when I'm looking at that Ace of Hearts, to me that's just saying that she had a broken heart.
It's a great, this is what I was saying last week about finding an access point, not only into a system but into a reading, and so for Liz, the access point was that the man is the Ace of Hearts. She died of cardiac arrest. So, that's kind of the thesis of the reading, I would say for you, Liz, is like, here's my thesis based on these cards. And then what you need to do then, I would say, is then prove it with the other cards in the spread. You know what I mean? But I think you can do that contextually. But again, a Lenormand reader would say most of these cards are not negative. The lilies is generally positive. The house is, and I sort of always is in quotes. The lilies in the house are always positive. The fish and the dog are always positive. The garden is neutral. The bear is fairly neutral. The fish are fairly neutral, and the man is neutral. So you have like a positive to neutral spread, which is another thing that a reader would say. So another reader or a Lenormand reader might say, well, no, you can't justify that thesis here because these cards are generally positive. Like tarot, I tend to let context guide me whether a card is positive or negative, because I think context matters. You know what I mean? And so I read, for example, in this reading, then the lilies as grief, as representing grief in that churchy way. So, and the question is about death. So it's hard, and not just death, but a sudden death, a shocking death. Those usually aren't, pleasant experiences in the way that sort of a planned death doula, family gathered sort of moment would be. So that, like, contextually, the question is not a positive one. And so I feel like I'm going to reach for the cards to explain a negative situation to me, or a negative feeling situation to me. And then the question is innately, for lack of a better word, negative, because it's, did this person die of grief? Did they die of a broken heart? So then I'm going to look to the cards to sort of speak that language. Does that make sense? So where a Lenormand reader would say these cards are inherently positive, for me, the question isn't. And so to indicate that, like, No, she just, there was like carbon monoxide in the house. You know what I mean? Like that negates the sadness of the question, I think. Looked like you were about to say something, Leslie.
Well, when I do this with tarot, I'll do the top left is the tone setter, the center is the idea, and then the bottom right is sort of like the outcome. And that sentence seems to be there was a lot of grief in the environment, right? But it's interesting. I also think about like when someone asks, especially a yes or no question, like what does a yes look like to me? Like what cards would I expect to see yes? And the heart isn't here. There's none of our tradition. There's no coffin. There's no scythe. There's no cross. It is interesting because immediately that to me says, well, it's a little more complicated, right? If I'm not seeing what I would consider to be a yes to that question.
Sure. And if we look at the traditional way of finding yes or no in Lenormand is to look at the suit colors. We have mostly red, but only by one. They're sort of evenly split hearts wise, diamonds wise. So technically, this would say the answer would be maybe yes. But it's so balanced suit wise that it would be hard to say affirmatively, so then there is more nuance, for sure.
I keep seeing that house is Graceland.
Well, I mean, that's the logical conclusion, right? And again, that is exactly the kind of way that things become literalized in this system, I think. Of course it's Graceland, which is where she's being buried and where her father was buried and where her son was buried. So, there's a whole other entry point to reading that row and that column too. So if then the house becomes Graceland, the lilies change to something that, is maybe decorative. I mean, Graceland was famously tacky, right? You know what I mean? So again, like that's maybe not contextual here, but these are all ways that we can sort of add nuance to the spread. And let's actually take it further since we're already sort of getting really deep. Let's look at houses. So houses are another way to add nuance to a spread if you want to, and they're part of the grand tableau. Now, there are kind of two ways to work with houses. One is with the grand tableau, and what I did here was I took the upper left corner of the grand tableau housewise. So on the left, these would be the top 9 cards in the upper sort of corner, upper left corner of the tableau. This one on the right puts the woman house in the middle. So this is kind of the middle bottom of the grand tableau. So the house of the woman is in the middle. So that's, if you look at the grand tableau, it would be kind of here on the spread. So these are not, but these are the houses as they would appear in the grand tableau. The other way to do it is to randomly draw houses. So you can use like a larger Lenormand deck, randomly draw your houses, and then put a smaller deck on top and draw those cards randomly, and those cards fall into those randomized houses. So that's another way of working with houses. Houses are really fascinating to me. Some things that are traditional, which means that, again, you get to use them or not, is that the houses only interact with the card that's on them. They don't interact with the cards around them. So, for example, the house of the scythe there in the middle is not like the cards interacting with each other. The only relationship the scythe has in this reading is to the fish. The fish interacts with the flowers, the scythe, the flowers, the dog, all of the other cards around it, but the house of the scythe is only related to the card that's sitting on it. So that's one traditional thing, is that they don't have any connection to the other houses. Does that make sense?
I'm totally lost. What scythe? Which scythe are you talking about?
So you see the titles above each card?
Yeah.
That's the house. So the fish is in the house of the scythe.
Oh, I see. All right, I got what you're saying.
Yeah. So the middle houses are flowers, scythe, and whip. Book is in the house of flowers. Dog is in the house of whip. The 3 cards can interact, but the 3 houses don't. So flowers, scythe, and whip only have a relationship to the card that's sitting on them.
I see.
And then they just color or shape or, infect, for lack of a better word, or perfume the card that sits on it. So we think about the scythe. What is a scythe? What does that do? It's going to shape the fish. you know. And so like if the fish has to do with money or abundance, then the scythe colors that somehow. So then the fish is impacted by the scythiness of the house it's sitting in. And I think this is where things can start to get kind of like, oh my God, like information overload, sensory overload. Like, again, you don't need the houses, but they're there if you want them.
Mhm.
When we look at the Grand Tableau, we'll look at a lot of techniques. And I think using the techniques of the Grand Tableau in the Grand Tableau makes sense because, again, you could kind of go haywire. But when you do a reading, traditionally you'll look for the signifier, the significator, and see what house they're in. So, like, let's say that this is the same question we're dealing with. The man could be the significator in the house of the fish. So then the man becomes sort of an abundant man or a rich man, you know, something like that. And it you know, where the significators are in the spread are meant to tell us a lot about, you know, where they are. So the rich man, or the man is rich or abundant or moneyed or an alcoholic, whatever the case is, you know, so I know what kind of man he is because of the way that the house he's in, or I know what area of life we're talking about. So this would then put the man in a position of being a reading about money or business, for example. Does that make sense? So where the significator falls in the house is kind of where you would immediately go in the reading to see what the reading is about. So that's one way that the significators play with the houses. In this case, you know, if we were reading for the woman, which the significator doesn't show up, we have the woman house, the fish is in the house of the woman. So, you know, if that's our significator, then again, we know that the feeling of the woman card is going to be connected to the fish in a way. So it's a really like, and maybe one of the reasons why it gets hard for folks to read is because there are so many ways to read it and so many levels at which you can do it that contextualizing the cards becomes difficult, you know. But if we were thinking about the last reading we did and all the things we talked about, let's just go to the top row and think about the way that we talked about the three cards, you know, just to sort of describing the situation and the way that each card is shifted or colored by the house that it's in. So the lilies is in the house of the writer. So in some way, the lilies becomes or takes on qualities of the writer. So the writer is news, which is something we talked a little bit about because of the letter in the previous. So there's the link there. The writer is fast. So that's a card that also has to do with quick. So whatever the lilies are could be happening quickly or be something fast. They could be news related, etc. The house is in the, the house is in the house of the clover. And so then that describes the house, or it impacts the house and the way the house is behaving. And the letter is in the house of the ship, which also has a travel quality like the writer does. So they sort of perfume, again, the quality of the cards in a way that can add more context and more texture to the spread. So like, let's think about the house in the house of the clover, which is hard to say. What does the clover do to describe the house?
If our house is in this situation, Graceland, which based on what we know, it's hard to see it not as that.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like this is referencing, again, that pattern of addiction, because everything regarding the whole Elvis institution was take this upper so you can get on stage and look fine. Do this so that everything looks fine. And it seems like perhaps this preconditioned need to be manicured and put on appearances is what I'm seeing there. It seems like there needs to, that this security is a manufactured security.
So the clover then becomes kind of a cover for reality.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think of the clover as being pretty positive usually, like it's luck, right? Or possibility. And this idea of Graceland, it's supposed to be you were born into this family with a lot of wealth and fame, privilege. It's supposed to be a positive thing, right? But it came with a lot of burdens for her. But I think it's this like incongruence between what it's supposed to be, what it's perceived to be, and then maybe what it felt like actually in it. But I don't know, the clover in the house feels innately positive.
You did sort of link to the card below it, in like the fish in the house of the scythe just now, though. Yeah. Like the abundance, it hurt.
Yeah.
How about the ship and the letter?
It seems like it's marking transition. Oh. So what is revealed in the letter maybe spurring on some sort of decision of some sorts, or the letter is just like this news is the latest update in a larger chain of events.
Nice.
Can I ask about the letter in general?
Yeah.
This is a trouble card for me because I know it's paperwork, I know it's messages, I know it's communications. When that doesn't feel relevant, what is the letter? Why not the writer if it's a message? Why not the book if it's information? You know what I mean? Like
that's actually the reason behind the Lenormand deck I was talking about earlier, because what he feels is that there are cards that have such similar connections. Why not that one? Why not the other? And so he combines them together. So I don't know if he combines the book, the letter, and the writer, but you know what I mean? He probably combined the book and the letter somehow. Yeah, I mean, this comes down again to sort of what is a letter? What is it for? What does it do? And so other than, being what you describe, I mean, a letter is what? It's something sealed. It's something sent.
It's a message. A book isn't a message, though.
Right. A book isn't a message. Theoretically. Yep.
I mean, I just mean like when something written, like, because that's how it was described to me. It's the difference between the letter and the birds is that birds is talking and letters is written down. So a letter is anything on paper, or an email or something like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. So many times I've pulled it like for myself in reading where there's no paperwork involved. There's no communication. It just doesn't feel relevant.
Sure.
I'm not saying that's happening here. It's just sort of an aside.
No, it's a great question because I find that too. That's sort of why we're here. And so the struggle becomes then to sort of dig into the thing and sort of figure out what it is. You don't have an example, do you, off the top of your head?
No. I can look back at my notebook.
If you want to, it's fine. I mean, we've only got about 10 minutes left.
I'll try and think of something for.
I'm just going to say, so if a letter isn't something written or something communicated, a message, what can it represent? And this kind of goes back to the Camille Elias thing of function and thingness, so a piece of paper, what is a piece of paper then? You know what I mean? Something thin, something crumple, you know what I mean? Like we then start asking questions like contextually about what is this beyond the associations I normally have for it. So, something folded, something signed, any kind of delivery. But again, if that doesn't make sense, what is being delivered? This is the struggle, is contextualizing it when the card doesn't make sense.
A letter can also, I mean, if you think about what a letter is, it's about your well-being, right?
Say more about that.
Sorry?
Can you say more about that?
Well, I'm just getting back, thinking back to what the core of the actual article is and what it conveys, and the well-being of like that top line is really so much about the core of the situation, you know, and her well-being.
And you make me think about the idea of what is the letter communicating. So what do letters communicate? You know, they check in about your well-being, or they ask questions, they ask for money, their bills, or, you know, inquiries, updates. Go ahead, Leslie. Looks like you want to say something.
No, I just love that about thinking about what the content would be, right? What the current state of something, or like, I guess it could be so like a negotiation between people, or a thank you.
Danielle said in the chat, with the lily, it makes me think of a will. Which is a great point. Yeah, that thingness, like it's like sometimes we do have to dig and say, like, what is this thing? What is it for? Why do we do them? Why do we have them? Or why do they exist to get there? So it's not always easy, but I think that once we start thinking that way about the cards, then it opens things up to us. You know, and it makes it make sense, but sometimes we do have to sweat it out a little bit to get there. Jules said in the chat, yes, and with the will, there's an idea of legacy and passing down resources for sure. And that then connects it to the house, right? Because the house is something willed, which is, you know, would take us into a different kind of question, because that would be about probate. But you know,
in the house. I'm sorry, I did not mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine.
No, I was thinking out loud that in the house of ship, too, it's kind of that slow moving, maybe that slow turn, you know.
Yeah. I also thought about movement as emotional earlier when we were chatting, as the ship, you know, the ship moves, and the letter or the document or the thing moves you. But, you know, being moved is not necessarily from point A to point B, but like from emotion A to emotion B, is a thing that I thought about. So like the way something behaves, you know, can also shift our sense of it. You know, like a movement isn't just, you know, getting a product across the ocean. You know what I mean? It can be an emotional movement. It can be a piece of music. You know, and so the way that we interpret movement is as a section of a symphony, for example, might someday be useful. You know what I mean? Especially if I'm reading for a musician or an artist. You know, something about that. Your movement. You know, this movement in your career is about writing. You know, with the letter in there. You know, and then at another time it might be about nature. I don't know. Did I just interrupt someone? Cool. All right. I like the way that houses kind of are there, but you don't have to read with them. Even when you're doing the grand tableau, you may or may not like dig into the house as something that means a whole lot. And I guess that goes for all of these techniques. Like one thing I didn't highlight in the other slides is that, and I think Leslie, you did do this, is you read the diagonal. So reading the diagonals is another thing that is done in this system, and daisy chaining. So if we look at the second example, I think it was the second. Oh no, the first example. Like the house of the dog, right? The dog shows up in the house of the whip. You can then daisy chain to the house of the dog, and then sort of connect these cards by, okay, sort of in the house is the dog of the bear, and then I would jump to the house of the bear, which we don't have. You know what I mean? But you can sort of connect cards by daisy chaining them. You know, the writer, the lily is in the house of the writer. Where's the writer? You know what I mean? And that's another thing that you can do. But really, the point is that you get the answer to the question. You don't have to use all these things. And part of, you know, getting good at anything, I think, is learning to sort of say, what tool do I need in this reading? Which again is another thing I talk a lot about with tarot, is like, what here are all the tools in my toolkit, which is the one that which are the ones that I need to use in this particular context that are going to help me get the answer. So they're all options, but they're not necessities. But I do like the way the houses kind of color the cards. To me, that's really interesting, and it's also a unique thing to Lenormand. There's not really any other system that's traditional. You know, a lot of people will use houses with kipper cards because it's a similarly sized deck, but that's not necessarily traditional. And a lot of them, in fact, will use the Lenormand houses with kipper. So because there are so many people in that deck, the houses don't quite make as much sense if you use the kipper cards. So anyway, we are coming up on the end of the day. That went really fast for me. I don't know about you.
That was so fast.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So we're going to kind of jump from here exactly where we are next week. But again, if you can think of any like pop culture things going on that we can read about and do a grand tableau or a couple grand tableaus about next week. I will find the name of that cartomancy book. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I cannot remember the name of it. It may be the one that Sophia mentioned earlier, but it had a different cover, so I'm thinking it's not that. But I'll find it. And yeah, let me know if you have any like things you want to talk about next week, or you know, if you do any readings over the week, we can talk about that next week too. So enjoy, everybody.
Thank you.
You.